You weren't an engraver. That's what they said. Just a number stamper. A desk clerk in the armory with nothing more important to do than scratch digits into steel. They said it with a smirk, with the casual dismissal that cuts deeper than insults. And Carla never corrected them. She simply kept working. But what they didn't know, what none of them had the eyes to see, was that each number she carved wasn't just an inventory code. They were coordinates, markers, fragments of something older, something alive in the silence of her steady hands. And one day, the commander himself would pause, see her engraving, and speak 4 words that froze an entire room. Delta Rune. Go to extraction. Before we begin, if you believe that respect isn't measured in how loud someone shouts, but in the quiet weight they carry, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story, like so many others, deserves not to be forgotten. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the small, windowless room where Carla spent most of her days. Late 20s, dark hair pulled back into a simple braid, sleeves rolled neatly above her wrists. She didn't look like much to the recruits who passed by. To them, she was invisible, a background figure hunched over a steel bench with a magnifying lamp and a set of engraving tools. The rhythmic scrape of her etcher against the polished frames of sidearms was the soundtrack of her life, steady, patient, deliberate. She was meticulous, every line uniform, every digit exact, her hands steady even during long nights when fatigue gnawed at her bones. She had been at this post for nearly 3 years, a civilian contractor among soldiers, assigned to catalog, repair, and engrave weapons. The job wasn't glamorous. No one clapped when she finished a batch. No one saluted when she logged serials. She was a shadow in a room filled with steel. The recruits laughed about it often. That's the job you get when you flunk out of basic. One had joked while walking past, balancing a rifle across his shoulders like a farmer with a yoke. Another added, "Bet she's never fired a weapon in her life. Probably thinks MREs are a video game cheat code." The laughter had rolled down the hallway like smoke. Carla hadn't flinched. She never did. She simply adjusted her magnifying glass and carved the next digit with the same calm precision as the last. But there was something different about her presence, something the sharpest among them sometimes caught without knowing why. It was the way she moved, not rushed, not hesitant, but with an economy of motion that only came from years of discipline. It was the way her eyes scanned every weapon before engraving, not just for placement, but for wear, for hairline fractures no one else noticed. And it was the silence. She didn't fill the air with chatter or excuses. She didn't laugh when they mocked her. She just worked, unbroken. Most overlooked that silence. One didn't. Private First Class Lucas Hensley, barely 20 and still carrying the wide-eyed weight of someone new to service, noticed how she handled each weapon as if it were alive. He'd linger sometimes after dropping off a pistol for remarking, curious. Once, he asked, "Do you ever get bored doing the same thing all day?" Carla didn't look up. Her voice was soft, even measured. Repetition teaches more than variety. Lucas hadn't known what to say to that, but the words stuck with him long after he left the room. To the rest of the base, Carla was just the armory girl. She didn't wear stripes. She didn't shout cadence. She didn't belong to their world, at least not in their eyes. And in the hierarchy of pride and uniforms, that was all that mattered. The lieutenants walked past her without a glance. The captain signed requisitions without learning her name. Even the sergeant major once brushed her aside when she tried to speak, muttering, "Not now, miss. Real business." What they didn't realize was that her silence wasn't submission. It was training. Carla had grown used to invisibility. In fact, she carried it like armor. She had been invisible once before, years earlier, long before this base knew her as an engraver. Back then, her name had been whispered in circles that never made it to press releases or after-action reports. Back then, invisibility had saved lives. But here, in this room of steel and laughter, her past was nothing more than a shadow box sealed tight inside her chest. She engraved numbers, she logged weapons, she nodded at officers who never nodded back. And in the quiet hours after the recruits had gone, when the lights hummed and the corridors were empty, she would sit alone at her bench, running her fingers gently over the metal she had marked. Her hands always paused for a moment when she etched certain numbers, strings of digits no one else would think twice about. Coordinates, extraction codes, ghosts of missions past. She never told anyone. She never explained. The younger ones would never have understood, and the older ones had long stopped asking questions that didn't come with paperwork. So she worked, and they laughed, and the hum of the engraving tool drowned out everything else. Until the day the commander walked in. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that crawled with routine. Recruits bustled in and out, returning pistols from the range, signing out rifles for drills. The chatter was casual, careless. Carla sat at her bench, bent over the cool steel frame of an M9, carving the next sequence into its side. Her etcher scraped, steady, deliberate. That was when the commander entered, tall, sharp-eyed, metals catching the dim light of the armory. The recruits snapped to attention, spine straight, eyes forward. But his gaze didn't sweep across them. It fell on Carla, still bent over her work, her tool etching a final curve into the metal. He stepped closer, slowly, his boots striking the floor with weight. And then he stopped. His eyes narrowed on the digits she was engraving. The recruits glanced at each other, confused, wondering why their commander had paused in front of the quiet armory girl. The room fell still. Carla didn't look up. She finished the digit with flawless precision, her hands steady, her breath calm. The commander's lips parted, his voice low, deliberate, carrying a weight that only she understood. "Delta Rune," he said softly. "Go to extraction." Carla set the etcher down gently, the sound of metal against the bench ringing like a bell in the silence. For the first time, she looked up, and the room changed. The recruits didn't understand. They heard the words, "Delta Rune, go to extraction," but they didn't feel their weight. To them, it sounded like jargon, a code phrase from some training manual they hadn't yet read, maybe an inside joke among officers. But the silence that followed told them otherwise. Carla met the commander's gaze. For the first time since she'd arrived on base, her posture shifted. She straightened slowly, not with arrogance, but with the unshakable bearing of someone who had once stood in darker rooms, waiting for orders that meant the difference between life and death. Her eyes, calm but sharp, held his without flinching. The recruits shifted uneasily. One of them, Lieutenant Dorsey, known for his quick tongue, half laughed. "Sir, it's just serial numbers. She engraves them all day. Nothing special." His words hung in the air, brittle, careless. The commander turned his head, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes locked on Dorsey. The lieutenant's smirk faltered almost instantly. There was no anger in the commander's gaze, no raised voice, no barked order. Just a quiet, unmistakable authority that pressed heavier than any reprimand. "Lieutenant," the commander said, his tone even, controlled, but sharp enough to cut through bone. "Do you know what you're looking at?" Dorsey blinked, swallowing hard. An engraving, sir." The commander stepped closer to Carla's bench. He pointed at the digits etched into the steel, a sequence of numbers that to the untrained eye looked like any other. But he knew. He remembered. "These are not random," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the armory. "This sequence is a dead drop marker, a code used in Operation Ravenfall, the mission that pulled 24 men out of hostile territory without a single casualty. A mission so classified, most of you weren't even born when the reports were locked away." The recruits glanced at one another, uneasy. The armory's hum seemed louder now, the lights harsher. The commander looked back at Carla. "You carried it forward," he said quietly. "Still engraving. Still remembering." Carla gave a single nod, as precise as the numbers she carved. She hadn't spoken a word, but she didn't need to. The truth was already unraveling before the stunned recruits. Private Hensley, the only one who'd ever really watched her work, felt his chest tighten. His grandfather had told him about Ravenfall, an operation whispered like legend among old veterans, where escape seemed impossible until a single unit cracked the code. And now, standing before him, the woman who'd been mocked as a number stamper had engraved those very codes by hand. The commander turned to the recruits, his voice harder now. "You think she stamps numbers because she's too weak to fight? You think she files weapons because she failed? Let me tell you who you've been ignoring. This woman, Carla Reyes, was Delta Rune, code specialist, field engraver, counterintelligence operator. She didn't just carve numbers into steel. She carved paths out of fire. Every mark she made in the field was a map, an instruction, a lifeline, and soldiers lived because of it." The words hit like thunder, but delivered in a whisper. The room had gone so quiet the scrape of a boot against the floor sounded like an explosion. The commander stepped back, his eyes still burning. You mocked her silence. You overlooked her patience. But those very things kept entire squads breathing. When your predecessors were trapped, bleeding, waiting for a miracle, they didn't pray for loud men who barked orders. They waited for Delta Rune to mark the way out. And she did. Carla said nothing. She simply returned her eyes to the pistol in front of her, resting her hand on the fresh engraving as though sealing the memory into the steel itself. One of the recruits, pale-faced now, whispered, She was there." The commander heard him. Not just there. She was the extraction. Every operation has a spear, but every spear needs a map. She drew those maps in shadows while bullets cracked the air. And she never once asked for credit. Not then. Not now. Lieutenant Dorsey's jaw clenched. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by something far heavier, shame. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. The recruits who had once laughed with him now avoided his eyes, unwilling to share in his embarrassment. Carla finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but carried the weight of iron. Respect isn't carved into rank. It's engraved in silence. The words hung there, simple, final. The commander turned toward the room again. Remember this moment. Because one day, you'll think you're the sharpest blade in the room. One day, you'll believe rank makes you untouchable. And when you do, remember her. Remember Delta Rune. Remember that the quiet ones you dismiss may be the only reason you make it home. He gave Carla one last nod, a soldier's acknowledgement, not an officer's courtesy, then stepped back. Carla returned to her work as if nothing had changed, her hands steady, her eyes calm. But the recruits knew better now. Every scrape of her etcher, every curve of a digit, was no longer invisible. It was a sound that carried history, one they would never forget. For the first time, they watched her work in silence. Not because they had been told to, but because they finally understood. And across the armory, the words Delta Rune, go to extraction echoed quietly in their minds, carving themselves into memory as surely as Carla had engraved steel. The armory never felt the same after that day. It wasn't just the air, though it seemed heavier now, filled with something none of the recruits could quite name. It wasn't just the silence, though they noticed it more, as if every scrape of Carla's etcher was a sound too sacred to interrupt. No, what changed was them. For the first time, they walked past her bench and didn't laugh. They didn't smirk. They didn't mutter. Some saluted. Most at least stopped long enough to watch, to wonder. Word spread faster than any official briefing ever could. Delta Rune. The nickname rolled through the barracks like contraband, whispered at bunks, traded in hallways. No one knew the full story, only fragments. She'd carved codes in foreign deserts. She'd written lifelines into the sides of rifles. She'd saved men who never even knew her name. And though the details blurred in the retelling, the reverence remained sharp. Carla never fueled the rumors. She didn't confirm, didn't deny. She just kept working, the same steady rhythm, the same careful patience. But something about her presence shifted. When she entered the armory, voices dropped. When she walked past, recruits straightened unconsciously. The woman they once mocked as the armory girl was now someone they couldn't look at without seeing the shadow of a history they had dismissed. It all came to a head 2 weeks later. The commander called an assembly in the base's main hall. Officers, recruits, even civilian staff filled the room. The podium stood empty under harsh lights. Conversations buzzed, nervous, uncertain. They all knew what it was about. Everyone had heard the story by now, even those who hadn't been there. And though some doubted, no one ignored it. When the commander finally stepped onto the stage, silence fell instantly. His voice carried steady, unhurried, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention. "You've been told about respect," he began. "You've been drilled on discipline. You've been lectured on loyalty. But I've watched many of you treat those words like decorations. Something you wear on the outside but don't carry inside." He paused, letting the silence settle deeper. 2 weeks ago, you mocked someone who has carried more for this country than you can imagine. Someone you dismissed because you thought you already knew her worth. Today, you're going to hear her name. Carla Reyes. Code Specialist. Delta Rune. The operator whose work pulled men out of places most of you couldn't point to on a map. She doesn't wear stripes. She doesn't shout orders. She doesn't need to. Because her work speaks louder than your laughter ever will. A ripple moved through the hall. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others sat straighter, suddenly aware of the weight of their ignorance. Then the commander stepped aside, and Carla walked in. No uniform, no ribbons, just her plain work jacket, her braid tied neatly back, her steady eyes scanning the room. She walked slowly, deliberately, her boots echoing softly against the polished floor. When she reached the podium, she didn't adjust the mic, didn't shuffle notes. She simply placed her hands lightly on the wood and looked out across the room. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence grew taut, pressing against the walls. And then, in a voice quiet but clear, she spoke. I didn't come here to tell stories. I didn't come here for recognition. I came here because silence, when left alone too long, becomes misunderstanding. Her eyes swept the room, not accusing, not pleading, just steady. You think engraving numbers is nothing. That silence means weakness. That patience is submission. But you don't understand. Every mark I've ever carved carried lives with it. Every code I left behind was the difference between men returning home or never being seen again. And every time I stayed silent, it wasn't because I had nothing to say. It was because words can't replace the weight of choices made in shadows. She let that sink in before continuing. Respect isn't earned in shouting. It's earned in what you protect when no one is watching. And if you forget that, if you treat patience like irrelevance or silence like emptiness, you will lose more than your pride. You will lose people you'll never get back. The hall was utterly still. No coughs, no shuffling. Just the heavy quiet of realization pressing on every chest. Carla stepped back from the podium. She didn't bow. She didn't wait for applause. She turned and walked off the stage with the same calm dignity she had walked in with. The commander returned to the microphone. That, he said firmly, is leadership. Not because she told you she was important, but because she never had to. From that day forward, the engraving bench in the armory was no longer dismissed as a corner for menial work. It became a station of reverence. Recruits approached it with caution, with quiet. Some even touched the bench lightly before heading out on missions, as if hoping some of her steadiness might pass into their hands. They began to call it the Rune Station. Months later, a plaque appeared above it, installed quietly one night without ceremony. It read simply, Delta Rune. In silence, lives were saved. Carla never asked who put it there. She never commented when recruits saluted as they passed, or when young officers approached her with hesitant questions. She just kept working, carving numbers that meant more than digits, numbers that carried weight, memory, and a legacy etched into steel. Years later, when Carla finally left the base, she didn't announce it. She left behind her tools neatly arranged, her bench spotless, and a small notebook placed on the surface. Inside, on the very last page, she had written 6 words. Respect is carved in silence daily. The recruits who found it didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They read it once, twice, and then copied it down into their own notebooks, their own lives. And so, long after she was gone, Delta Rune remained, not in medals, not in speeches, but in every quiet decision made by those who had once thought silence was weakness. They knew better now. They knew silence, when earned, was the loudest truth of all.